Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Or, to be or not to be, that is the question. Et tu, Brute? Or, you're going to eat me out of house and home. Those are just few of the quotes from some of the plays by a man named William Shakespeare. And we're in lesson 102 that talks about him because he lived way back then, but he was in the beginnings of some famous theatrical work. He was a playwright, he was a poet, he was an actor. Well, he was born on April 23rd, 1564, to John and Mary Arden Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon. On the banks upon Avon means on the banks of Avon. It's about 75 miles northwest of London in England. His father was a merchant, a glove maker, a farmer. He was very successful. He attended the free grammar school there, and he learned Latin. He also loved to go down to the market towns in Stratford-on-Avon, where the holidays they'd have pageants and plays, and many of those plays would be about Robin Hood. He married Anne Hathaway in 1583. They had twins, Hamnet and Judith, and another little girl named Susanna. And Hamlet died in 1596 at the age of 11, his son. So he had the two daughters that grew into adulthood. We don't know that much about his life, but we know so much about his plays. Shakespeare writes and acts in London, and he traveled around town to town, playing in courtyards. In 1592, he performed and wrote plays in the theater called The Rose. He also loved to go to the outdoor theaters. Well, most of the theaters were outdoor back then, and he wrote his narrative poems and he'd read poetry. In 1594, he was a member of Lord Chamberlain's company that's called the Chamberlain Men, and they would act and sell tickets. Lord Chamberlain was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth, so he was alive during the time of Queen Elizabeth and then on into the reign of King James I, and both loved his plays. Shakespeare wrote plays for groups to perform 2 times a year during this time, and then he invested in the profit of his plays too. He was very financially successful. He played at the Swan Theater, which was very famous theater, and also at the Globe Theater in 1599, and it held a capacity of 3,000 people. The Globe burned in 1613, right after the performance of one of his plays, Henry VIII. It was like this 20-sided theater that had a covered balcony, very beautiful, and they would come out dressed in very elaborate costumes. It was quite amazing. It drew heavy crowds. All of his plays did. Well, Queen Elizabeth loved his plays and paid composers and musicians to entertain her. She even sang herself, and she played the lyre. And she also, or I should say lyre, I don't know how you pronounce that. She also liked poetry, and she loved plays, especially Shakespeare's plays. James I in 1603 was a sponsor of the Lord Chamberlain's company, the King's Men, and he had them play in the Blackfriars Theater, an indoor theater that had candlelight at night. In 1609, the publisher printed a collection of sonnets by Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote many sonnets which were like poetry. 1611 to 1612, Shakespeare retires and he moved on to Stratford-on-Avon. He didn't retire that long until when he saw both of his daughters married. 1607, Susanna got married. In 1616, Judith got married. But in 1616, right after his daughter got married, Judith, on April 23rd, which is his birthday, He was 52 years old when he died. Pretty young. Maybe not so young for the time, but pretty young, I would say, since I'm 60. His plays published, many of them after he died. In 1623, two of his former associates published his plays in a first folio, 36 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 long narrative poems. Most of his plays were historical. He took them from historical happenings and read a lot about history. And a lot of them were tragedies. Tragedies were very sad. They had a sad ending. And some of them were comedies. Sometimes comedies that had kind of a satirical background, like, and even today we do have some of those tragedies and comedies that of course everyone knows, Romeo and Juliet, and what a tragedy that is. And Hamlet, another tragedy. And a few others. But anyway, he's very influential in the time because of his way with words and his vivid characters. He talked about ghosts and witches, and he captured attention in the heart and the difference of good and evil in the judgment day. He based his plays on human experience, love, ambition, jealousy, hatred were some of the themes. And he used the English language so beautifully. He actually probably had 20,000 words to our normal 1,000 words. He even created his own words. Some of them, like the green-eyed monster, the foregone conclusion, fashionable, soft-hearted, lacklust. Those were some of his words. Parting is such sweet sorrow. It's another. He had over 2,000 references in his plays to the Bible, actually to the King James Bible, who was king at that time. Some of his comedies were The Taming of the Shrew, and that was about a hot-tempered woman marrying a man that she doesn't like. Midsummer Night's Dream, fairies who play tricks on people who wander in the woods. His tragedies, as I said, Hamlet, a prince who has to avenge his father's death. Romeo and Juliet, a boy and a girl fall in love, but their families hate each other. Historical plays were Julius Caesar, et tu, Brute, his best friend, as part of his assassination. Richard III, an English king that put the princes in the tower, a very evil king. Or Henry V in his eloquent speech at the Battle of Agincourt in France. Or maybe Henry VIII and his 6 wives, 2 beheaded. Othello is where the word the green-eyed monster came from. Macbeth is a nobleman who wanted to be king, even if he could murder his brother who was king at the time. But all end up dead in the midst. Very tragic play. Some of the sayings: something is rotten in Denmark, the Hamlet. To be or not to be, from Hamlet. A horse is a horse. A horse, a kingdom for my horse, King Richard. You're going to eat me out of house and home, Henry IV. Or maybe just that romance of Romeo and Juliet. So he's to be remembered, William Shakespeare. And maybe you'll be reading some of his plays, or either parts of his plays, as you go on, as almost every high school and college student is familiar with William Shakespeare. Maybe someday you'll be one of those writing plays that they'll be listening to, and reading in the future.